within Mackay, Margaret Meyer, and Brian Moss. And the way how we are going to run this session is that we gave the speakers 2 questions to think about, and we do 2 rounds. The first round will focus on the continuities and discontinuities of protest and policing right now in the UK, in the US, in various parts of the world. And in the second round, we will look at the futures of protest. And in each round, each speaker has 6 minutes, so that we have 24 minutes for each round. And then we open up the discussion for the audience, and you can put your comments or questions into the chat, or you can raise your hand. We are planning to record the first part of the event, the presentations of the speakers, and then we turn off the recording when we go to the discussion with the audience. So if everybody is happy with that, Matt and Valentina will start recording, because I can then focus on the chairing. And we will also, or Valentina will put links into the chat with more information about our 4 speakers and other information that we think would be interesting to share. And so in order to move on and not lose more time, I would like to start with our first speaker, Graeme Hayes, who is reader in political sociology at Aston University. His research focuses on environmental social movements, civil disobedience, and criminal trials of activists. His most recent book is Breaking Laws, Violence and Civil Disobedience and Protest, which was published in 2019. And he's also editor of environmental politics and consulting editor for social movement studies. Graeme, over to you.
That's lovely. Thank you so much, Silke. And thank you so much for the invitation. I think this is a really, really lovely event. What I wanted to do in trying to respond to that very first question and thinking about protest and policing in the time of the pandemic, I'm going to be somewhat parochial and focus on the UK, if that's all right. And I'm trying to think about a framework for understanding the relationship between protest and protest rights and the police courts sentencing and crime bill, which was introduced in March of this year into Parliament without a green paper, without a white paper, which I think is very interesting, and has since been kicked not into the long grass, but into the very slightly longer grass. So it's not yet become law, and it raises a number, I think, of very interesting, very serious questions about the future of protest rights in Britain, and about the movement of bodies, particularly bodies which are deemed out of place, and about the access to public voice, which is challenging voice. And I want to think about 3 different paths to this of different lengths, perhaps. David Mead, who is a professor of protest law at the University of East Anglia, has written a number of very, very good blogs on this. So I'm going to rely a little bit on some of the things that he writes. But one of the things he talks about is just very briefly, is a much longer evolutionary path. So if we go back to the 1930s and to the first Public Order Act of 1936, which was brought in part as a response to Mosley's fascist agitation. One thing that you can see, if you trace the development of protest law in the UK, it's always been moving in the same direction. In other words, greater restrictions on rights, greater restrictions on access to public space, greater restrictions on the movements of bodies, so placing increased conditions and introducing new penalties. And we think particularly about the introduction of aggravated trespass in 1986. in the POA 1986. The only move away from that has been in the introduction of the Human Rights Act in 1998, which is particularly important because it transposed the European Convention of Human Rights, and particularly Articles 10 and 11, which are the rights to freedom of expression and the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association into domestic law. And I think one of the things that's really important to stress about this is that the duty of the police under that statute is to facilitate protest. And that is not a duty which is about the lawfulness of protest. Lawfulness is a different category from peaceful protest. And that's because under ACHR case law, the democratic rights of freedom of expression and association should not be restricted. Okay, now it's different obviously when you have conditions of violence. But this is in terms of peaceful assembly. And I want to kind of hold that thought because I'm going to come back to it. The second, I think, evolutionary path is one which I'm going to call austerity. And now this isn't reducible to austerity. This is about much wider currents to do with the retreat of the state, the crisis of social democracy, the development of neoliberalism and the privatization of everyday life, and also to do with everyday borderings. But I think one of the main ways we talk about austerity is we talk about it as economic austerity. One of the things I would argue is there are different regimes of austerity. There's political austerity, there's ideological austerity, and there's civic austerity. And this is a series of democratic enclosures which restrict collective public participation, restrict the range of ideas which are able to be discussed in public space, and restrict the range of action in public space. And we can see this in 2008, 2010, this reduction of the limits of the sayable. 1 minute, okay, reduction of the limits of the sayable. So again, I'd like to hold that thought, and this imposition of restrictions on bodies and voices. And the final point I'd like to make is about Broxbourne and Bristol. I think one of the things that's really interesting, given the fact there's no green or white paper, is what is the PCSC here to do? What's its function? And the two actions which really seem to provoke it were the XR action outside the Murdoch Distribution Centre and the removal of the Colston statue and throwing it into the water. One of the things I'd say about that is, of course, in both those cases, the police respected and facilitated protest. In the Broxbourne case, activists were arrested once they'd come down. In the Colston case, the police did not intervene during that site of the public square. So again, I think it's really important to think about this as being a restriction on bodies, a restriction on movement, a restriction on voice, and a direct reaction to police upholding the rights of the European Convention on Human Rights.
Thank you very much, Graeme. And I know how hard it is to stay within 6 minutes. So I'm moving over to Finn Mackay, and I think it follows very well that you speak after Graeme. Finn is senior lecturer in sociology at the University of the West of England, and the author of Radical Feminism, Activism and Movement. And Finn has a forthcoming book that I'm very much looking forward to, which is entitled Female Masculinities and the Gender Wars, The Politics of Sex, which will appear in October from Bloomsbury. Finn has been involved in feminist activism for over 20 years, and I'm very, very looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. Just following on actually from what Graeme was saying about the Colston toppling point here in Bristol, where I am based at the moment. Following the local elections, we actually now have a Conservative PCC who is quite tough on crime and disorder. So I think that is going to make a difference to the cases that are waiting to go through the courts still. And I do fear that some of those activists are going to face a bit of a harsher response and maybe made an example of in some way. So I think that was quite worrying news after the local elections. So yeah, my work on social movements has mainly been on, as my book suggests, feminist activism, and particularly feminist activism against male violence against women and children. So the book from Palgrave, that was on continuity and change in feminist activism from the so-called second wave in the 1970s and 80s to the later and newer resurgence, sometimes called the third wave, fourth wave. The number of waves seems to increase every day and I lose track, but basically the resurgence of feminist activism in the UK from the early 2000s. So continuity and change in that was obviously a very broad question. So I entered into that question through the lens of looking at the Reclaim the Night marches, which, you know, as women's nighttime marches in towns and city centres against all forms of sexualised male violence against women. That march, Reclaim the Night, first began in Leeds in 1977. And it was founded by the Leeds Revolutionary Feminist Group. Of course, quite significant reasons why it started in Leeds at that time in the 1970s, and why it resonated so much there. You know, it was to do with actually the issue of rape was being discussed in the movement at that time. There had been actions in West Germany prior, a few months prior. But of course, there was also the influence of one of Britain's most notorious serial killers, Peter Sutcliffe, who of course press dubbed the Yorkshire Ripper, who murdered 13 women over that time period. And the police advice to women was to stay in, not go out, and not go out after dark, which didn't really make any sense at all for people who had work or caring responsibilities, and let alone in a country where it can get dark at 3:30 in the afternoon. So that really resonated, and that's perhaps why, you know, it's probably no coincidence the marches started there. So I talked to feminist activists from different generations, some that had been involved in that march in the 70s, and then some that had only been involved, you know, post the early 2000s. And so what I noticed was a professionalization that had occurred. That was an accepted feature for younger activists in a way that it was not accepted for second wave activists. So even the fact, for example, that the contemporary Reclaim the Night marches, and still to this day, would usually have police permission, which would be arranged in advance. There would be road closures. There would be stewards trained. Well, that was all an anathema to the marches when they first started, which were spontaneous and did not involve the police on principle. But that was taken for granted now, that the police would be involved, that permission would be needed. Most groups, local groups around the country, they took it for granted they would need funding from local community safeguarding boards, for example, supportive trade unions. Again, that was just seen as a given. So that professionalization has, and obviously a lot of these young women activists, as they were in the main, you know, had been influenced by a decade of new Labour politics, which I think had an impact as well. And you know, Graeme has already mentioned other changes in public space, you know, the increasing private ownership of public space. So bylaws attached to public spaces that were not there before, that you might only find out about when you try to do something in that public space. More CCTV, you know, less communal housing, less possibility to live communally or get involved full-time in activism. All of those changes have had an effect. So that professionalization is still with us. It clashes with a more DIY approach to protest and organising, which was maybe a feature of the, what does that say, sorry? Yeah? One, yeah, cool. I'm just coming up now, which was a feature of the 1980s and 1990s. And we can see maybe those tensions around a more recent protest around male violence against women, which was the Reclaim These Streets protests after the tragic murder of Sarah Everard. But that is getting into the second question, so I will come back to that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Margit Meyer, who has been a professor for comparative and North American politics at the Freie Universität Berlin, where I met her about 30 years ago. And she is now senior fellow at the Center for Metropolitan Studies at Technical University Berlin. she has written a lot about neoliberalism and neoliberal urbanism. And that is also her recent publications include urban uprisings challenging to the neoliberal city in Europe. So that follows very nicely on what Finn just mentioned, and Graeme as well. Her more recent publications concern progressive movements in the United States, and that's what you're also talking about, I guess.
Thank you, and also thanks for organizing such a splendid conversation on such important questions. Yes, as a matter of fact, this past winter, I was following both Germany and the US in terms of how the pandemic might have affected social movements in both countries. And I've actually published, alas, only in German so far, 2 pieces on progressive movements and leftist movements in the US in this particular moment. So and since then, I've been trying to think about how or what role the pandemic may have played in the upsurge and the reshaping of movements that have actually pre-existed. So I'm not looking at the anti-corona and anti-measures movements, but the host or panoply of movements that have been unfolding in the US ever since Occupy Wall Street, and then proliferated even more under the 4 years of Donald Trump. And then in 2020, we had a very peculiar and special year, not only because the pandemic became one of the conditions that explain the intensity and the breadth of what has come to be called the George Floyd protests, which to an extent explain its novel characteristics, but also it was a year of an election in a very divided, deeply divided country, where half the people were hoping that Trump would leave the White House at the end of it. And when presidential candidate Sanders had mobilized a very strong movement of supporters, which then, once he withdrew, intersected with a broad variety of all kinds of social justice activism, creating quite a fertile social movement situation. And most importantly, in this terrain, of course, were the movements against racial injustice and racist state violence, which had been growing ever since the police murders of Eric Garner in New York and Michael Brown in Ferguson, but received more national attention and some organizational coherence under the hashtag Black Lives Matter in 2012 already. And then the murder of George Floyd last May, almost exactly a year ago, reignited this movement. And in spite of the crisis proportions the pandemic manifested at that time, it triggered an unprecedented wave of mobilizations across the country, from initial local uprisings to a nationwide, multi-ethnic mass movement that would not let down for months. And that was obviously primarily protesting against racism and police violence, but it actually was not reducible to Black Lives Matter. So, in my thinking, 2 points matter. One is the peculiar historical situation shaped by the pandemic, but not only, which explain some discontinuities in the movement trajectory. And then secondly, what are the novelties, what the changes in contrast to earlier similar movements? And there three seem to be important to me. The composition, which is more multi-ethnic and also in many ways more intersectional, or it's shaped by more intersectionality. Secondly, there are new demands which are rather comprehensive. For example, when Black Lives Matter already in 2016 published its vision for Black lives, these were more than 50 different organizations that collectively came up with this vision statement. It not only included a plan for ending structural racism, but also for how to achieve ecological and social transformation. And also new, of course, was the demand that had never been raised in such a wide scale, the defund the police demand, viewed by many as transformative, but interestingly, not easily embraced in Black communities. And the third novelty that matters, at least in response to Silke's question, of last year's movements were the very direct political responses this movement received. Unlike other movements at this time, here police reforms were passed by many cities and some states, and also there are efforts on the national level now. And that is sort of on the one hand, a very interesting response. And on the other hand, there have been responses both from the corporate world and by philanthropic organizations, massive responses in the billions, showering the Black Lives Matter movement with funding, with also interesting and noteworthy effects, of course. So Silke, how many minutes do I have to go into any details? Zero. Okay, good. But we don't need details, or I can use some to illustrate
later on in the discussion.
Yeah.
Thank you. This was brilliant. And I think also it now follows on so well that we will hear from Brian Moss, a dear colleague here in Southampton. Brian is a lecturer in criminology. His research focuses on policing and regulations. He has taught at universities in the UK and Ireland before coming to Southampton. And prior to his academic appointments, he worked in research roles within oversight in nonprofit bodies in Ireland and Belgium, and as a probation officer. So I'm very, very interested to hear your perspective on the issue.
Thank you very much. Hopefully I'm coming across okay. Just first of all, to thank Valentina, Matt, and Silke for the opportunity to speak today. There are other colleagues within the department who I know who have much wider experience in the policing side, but hopefully what I can bring or introduce is, separate from the speakers earlier on, is rather than the social movement end, is the policing side, as Silke's pointed out. Having worked in police inspectorates, having worked in the police oversight or police ombudsman body as well, I've kind of seen it from the other side and kind of the views that they take of the perspective. So hopefully what I'm going to do, at least in this first 6 minutes, is lay out what I think are some of the continuities and some of the discontinuities that we see, particularly arising from the last year around COVID. And at the end, very end, I'm going to make some connections back to some of the points that the esteemed speakers have already made, with a view to trying to bring us all along and see how it all kind of comes together. Very briefly, in terms of continuities, I think it's important to point out from the policing perspective, at least, and I'm not coming from a policing perspective, but what they might argue is that they've been preparing for these kind of events. They've been preparing for protest over a number of years, and a number of inspectorates and police organizations themselves have brought out a number of reports to try and say what they've done right or what they've done wrong. So there's an issue here, I suppose, about police preparation. There has been a level of preparation prior to COVID. Now, I'm not going to say it's good or bad just yet. I'll get into that later on. But my focus here would be particularly my own home background, the Irish Republic or Ireland, looking as well at Northern Ireland, Scotland, but also England and Wales. And the reason I've decided to do that today is, as many of us will know, many of our students tend to just focus in or hone in on the USA or England and Wales. And I think it's important to bring back in that focus on, as well in Northern Ireland, but also in Scotland, who gets overlooked, I think, a little bit. What I would like to argue is that there's a continuity, or there's a range of consistency across the jurisdictions in terms of what they do or what they haven't done in terms of policing and protest in the pandemic. So the first point is there about a level of police preparation, that they have tried to engage, not always successfully, but there is a level of preparation by them. There's a number of reports there. The inspector in England and Wales is probably the most proactive, or the Parliament in England and Wales has probably been the most proactive since about 2004 in terms of protest. There's probably bigger gaps there than we would anticipate in terms of Northern Ireland and also in Scotland. And the Irish Republic has been catching up a little, but I think it's more of a haphazard approach. As someone who has recently worked in the Department of Justice, I'm quite comfortable and happy to say that. And there's a number of gaps there that we can talk about, I think, and point up. The second issue is what we expect from the jurisdictions. What do we expect from Northern Ireland policing? What might we expect from English and Welsh policing? And I think there are some national ideas there, and academics increasingly have come out and criticized, the exceptionalism or what we expect to see in any jurisdiction. Are we going to take wholeheartedly or wholesale the ideas from the USA, or is the policing here somewhat different? And I mean the policing in England and Wales. And the policing is very different across the British Isles. Northern Ireland exceptionally different from England and Wales, both the history and the model that it tries to adopt. I think we'd have seen that in recent events. And one of the things that comes up particularly is a recent Sinn Féin funeral that took place in 2020 and the aftermath that has rumbled on into 2021. And not just what view that gives us of the police, but in terms of the loyalist views of how the nationalist community are policed, and the difference of views there, and how the idea of policing has fundamentally flipped, arguably in the last 20 years. But not just that, in terms of, that Northern Ireland is moving in a particular direction, and England and Wales is going in a particular direction under the Conservative government, but also arguably there's a view there about Irish policing and Irish culture. And we can't just dismiss these or take them for granted that they're going to go in a particular direction. I think the Irish approach has been much more haphazard, again, from events that I've seen in the last couple of months. And again, I can draw on a range of reports here over a number of years, but I think we can leave those for later discussion. The other issue there in terms of culture is the police culture. We expect that police will somehow have changed overnight to become much more cohesive, holistic, engaging, and so on. And there's been a number of academic reports, parliamentary reports, and so on. But we still see time and again the issues about us and them, the police versus the other. And I don't think that idea has disappeared. We also have within the wider public, in looking at some materials and preparing for today, that there is no cohesive public out there in terms of if a social movement emerges, that it'll be universally supported. And I think the Scottish government came out with some interesting materials there over the last year that has shown quite a diverse opinion, and thank you, Selga, in terms of what people look for, whether it's enforcement or whether it has been discipline or whether it's been protection of civil liberties. There's also the PR role, and the police are great at putting out PR in terms of how they engage with certain events. And we think only about 2009 and the death of Ian Tomlinson there and the initial reports that went out from police, they were very positive. There was nothing to see here as such. And we know when we start to pull back the stones, there's more there than we'd like to care, or that we'd like to expect. In terms of discontinuities, I think the issue about unpredictability very much emerges, particularly in the English and Welsh context, whether it's the judicial review exercise ongoing at the moment, the human rights review, or the police crime and sentencing and courts bill. I think we've got an increasingly fragmented target audience in terms of who's engaged in social movements. I think that's been hit upon by some of the speakers already. I think there's new methods of protest emerging that concern. So in Wales, there's been a concern around protest of one, sitting in the middle of the road, protesting about environmental issues. And my two final points, I think in terms of when we talk about protest, we need to move beyond the idea of active protest. Arguably the funeral that took place, the national funeral in Northern Ireland in 2020, was more of a passive continuation of an entrenched resistance against what was seen as then the majority political viewpoint. But there's also the ideas of riot. Where does riot fit in to our ideas of protest? Is it something that is latent or more manifest? And the London School of Economics would have looked at the role of the 2011 riots as a form of protest. And then finally, my very final point in terms of discontinuities, increasingly we're seeing the emergence of technology, and whether it's predictive policing or super recognizers in terms of faces or facial recognition technology, we're increasingly seeing that as having a role in protests that takes it away from being more a kind of a sporadic or instantaneous event to being more controlled and measured, and then prosecutions and so on over time. That's where I'd see the discontinuities emerging.
Thank you very much. I know how incredibly hard it is to be so concise, so I thank you for that. And we'll just move over to the second round and going back to Graeme and ask him about the future of protest and policing.
Oh Lord, what a question. Right, so first of all, I'm not sure I'm quite, we went to, me and my co-author Brian Doherty went to a very early meeting with Extinction Rebellion in London in September 2018, and there were 30 people sitting around in a room, and Brian and I looked at each other afterwards and said, well, this is all very nice, but nothing will happen. So I'm not entirely certain I'm very good at looking into a crystal ball. I will try to say a couple of positive things, but I think I'm going to come back to these evolutionary paths. I think the very first positive thing, as a number of speakers have already pointed out, have been Black Lives Matters movements, and certainly for me, this is one of the most hopeful, positive developments in the social movement scene certainly in the UK. And I think in particular, the centering of structural inequality and the centering of discussions around empire have been incredibly important in British public life, and that they will continue to be very, very important in terms of how we conceive of an us. So I think that's really important. I think also it's been really important is that we have seen a number of community actions in Bristol against the PCSC bill, in Pollokshields just last week against the forced removal, the attempted forced removal of two people by immigration control. And looking at the collective response to that, I think has been, again, a very, very interesting salutary response to these questions of everyday borderings and everyday restrictions on who is allowed to have a public voice and who is not allowed to have a public voice. However, I don't want to over romanticize that. We're talking about people which have very strong local social solidarities, and that we can see very, very different responses or absences of responses in different places. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. One point that I do want to make is about the kind of, what I see as the Conservative project, about increasingly defining bodies which do not fit. But also, I think we can see the policing of protest or the PCSC bill as part of a much wider question of restricting voice. And in fact, it does seem to me that liberalism has been brought into a trap where this conservative restriction of public voice has been effected whilst claiming liberal values around rights and freedoms, and liberalism itself, because I can't say it doesn't have an analysis of power, but because its analysis of power is perhaps not as strong as it might be, I think has struggled to respond to that. And I do think that one place that we're heading, and you can see this in the higher education bill in the United Kingdom, see this in our everyday lives about what we're able to teach and what we're able to talk about, and the increased restrictions on those. And both Brian and Finn, I think, mentioned a really crucial aspect, which is surveillance and technology. And those are elements, those increasing surveillance of everyday life, increasing technologization of access to public space are going to create real and very difficult barriers to collective public action. However, one thing to finish with, just one final thought on this, is that even though this is following these evolutionary paths, I do think that collective public action itself has never been more important. And I also think that it's the public response to these measures which is more important perhaps than the proposals themselves in the PCSC bill. So I don't want to be I don't want to be excessively Eeyore-ish about this. I do think that there is an awakening of collective public agency, and even though that I do feel that Extinction Rebellion, for instance, on the climate change has been very post-political, and Brian mentioned this single person protests, this individualization, this very kind of proximate imaginings of the future, which are very much about the self and the projection of the self into the future. You know, for my children, for my grandchildren, there must be intergenerational justice. Those are also very, very, very laudable, but it tends to be on a citizens basis of action. I do think that there is also a reclamation of public agency in this, of taking the debate away from technologies and taxes and markets and so on and so forth, and recentering it on how we live and how we wish to live within the future. The question is whether that future will look different from or very similar to the way it is now.
Perfect. Thank you. Finn.
Yes, so I think that the pandemic regulations, the COVID regulations, perhaps have pushed a return by accident rather than design, but have kind of pushed a return out of necessity to a more 1990s style kind of DIY activism. You know, as opposed to that professionalization that had been there in social movements. And so, as I said in the last part, I think we can see that in what happened with the Reclaim These Streets vigils that were planned in South London, which, you know, even the name of that is interesting, because a lot of people thought that it was a Reclaim the Night action, but the name was actually Reclaim These Streets. So it speaks to Reclaim the Night, but then it also uses this name that we will all know, of course, it's from the 1990s anti-roads protests and the Anti-Criminal Justice Act protests, which was Reclaim the Streets. So Reclaim These Streets was working with the police. It was in talks with the Met about how the vigil was going to go ahead with social distancing. And then the police changed tack. They threatened the group members, 4 friends who were organising it, with fines of £10,000 per each, as per the regulations, and prosecution. They launched a crowdfunder on Crowd Justice to pay for solicitors to challenge these restrictions. On the 13th of March, the High Court said they were not going to get involved with the disagreement with the Met. And it was confirmed again that the organisers would be fined. All the vigils across the country couldn't go ahead. We then saw what happened, which was lots of people turned up anyway, independently, to Clapham Common, including members of the NVDA group, Sisters Uncut. And then as night fell, we all saw the images, of course, of the police manhandling women protesters, ripping down banners and making arrests. The following day, the 14th of March, obviously, despite the restrictions still there, Sisters Uncut publicised that they would be going along and protesting outside Scotland Yard to protest that police harassment, as they saw it, of those people who had been attending the vigil. And also to raise awareness of the Police Crime and Sentencing and Courts Bill. So hundreds attended, and then they marched to Parliament Square. Now, on that bill, of course, there's been lots of other protests, not least here in Bristol, where I live, and all of these do remind me of actions against the Criminal Justice Act, 1994. And I think, you know, we can see this difference of approaches between the funded kind of bureaucratic, professionalized version, which is vulnerable to state censure and to state silence, because it's within the state system, it makes itself identifiable. And then we have the more anonymous DIY approach, which in this climate of the regulations has the benefit of remaining unidentifiable. I know there's all the surveillance we've talked about, spontaneous, fluid, it can move around. Now, the lack of those formal structures, there are pros and cons to that, of course. There are people with mobility problems, caring responsibilities, health problems, children, you know, accessibility needs, insecure immigration status, who need to know how long is a protest going to be? Is it a march? Is it a blockade? Where's it going to go? Where's it going to end? How am I going to get home? Am I going to get arrested? How long is it going to take? So there's pros and cons, of course, with these different types of resistance, but I think we are seeing a return to DIY activism, The COVID restrictions have almost revived that form of activism out of necessity. And myself being from a background of NVDA in peace activism in the 1990s, I was actually one of the first peace campers to be arrested for aggravated trespass under the Criminal Justice Act 1994. So I am heartened to see this return to this type of activism, but I am sorry that we still need it, and if anything, need it more than ever before. And I'm still angry that we're railing up against the same censure. Thank you.
Thank you, Finn. That was very moving. Margit.
It's probably no surprise that most of our answers to this question of yours are both on a positive and on a negative side, and nobody knows which side of the scale will prevail, because there are lots of imponderabilia that will determine. So all we can do is list the factors on each side. And the way I've been looking at the Black Lives Matter movement and related movements in the US, what I found striking and promising is the extremely diverse composition of this movement in all kinds of ways, not just ethnicity and background, but also in terms of different generations and different job categories. Many observers have identified the large preponderance of low-wage sector workers within the movement, like Donna Murch, who did interviews in Ferguson, was struck by how many of these, especially the young people and activists and organizers, had previously already been active in the fight for 15 minimum wage. And she makes a strong argument about intersectionality being viewed as a given in this new type of organizing, where labor organizing and this type of social and racial justice kind of movement are invigorating each other. Now, this could potentially develop into a fortifying and strengthening direction of the movement. On the other hand, what I have been observing with growing concern is the effects of all the funding which philanthrocapitalism has poured into the Black Lives Matter movements, with the to be expected effects. We know, I mean, the United States has a long history of what happens when community organizations and any wave of previous movements got to enjoy the largesse of the Ford Foundation. And with Black Lives Matter, it especially, well, the Ford Foundation already in 2014 poured $100 million into Black Lives Matter leadership. The three women who created the hashtag, and then with all that funding, created an interesting three-part organizational structure consisting of a PAC, Black Lives Matter Political Action Committee, of its head, Black Lives Matter Global Network, and a third unit called Black Lives Matter Grassroots, supposedly to support the work of their 50+ local chapters across the US. However, since the funding comes with strings attached, the usual kind, you have to be responsible to the foundation and not to your rank and file. You have to speak in middle-class language, blah, 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 and so on and so forth, had the effect that a whole bunch of chapters have severed, have left, have disassociated themselves from this organization. And because it became too intransparent, because it sidled up to the Democratic Party, because it put all the political emphasis on electoral struggle, endorsing political candidates while the chapters were still active in their local defund the police campaigns, holding police accountable on their local whatever happened there. So this has an effect that might really split the movement and encourage trends that we have already encountered in previous Black Power movements, where Black unity became the defining sort of identitarian core of the movement, which makes it very hard to build cross-cutting broad alliances with other ethnic groups, with white solidarity groups. And that is what we increasingly need more and more, given all the factors that other speakers have already highlighted: the shrinking room to maneuver due to the sharpened police laws, and also the austerity measures, and so on and so forth. So it's going to be both a promising situation, but also a very challenging new terrain.
Thank you very much, Margit. Brian, over to you.
Okay, I'm going to be trying very quick, and I do want to try and respond to some of the items the other speakers have mentioned, because I think they're important here. If I could start with Graeme's about bodies and being out of place, I think we're going to increasingly see more bodies out of place, because I don't think policing is going to change as much as we would think it will do or should do. In respect of Finn's idea around DIY approach, I think as a response to the non-movement of policing, I think we're increasingly going to see more DIY approaches to protest emerge. That would be my expectation. So as one side faces off against the other, we try and increasingly find new or novel ways of doing that. So while the inspectorate in England and Wales has talked about intelligence and generating more and more intelligence on activists and on protest movements, I think obviously what activists are going to do is try and generate new and novel ways of going about what it is they do to protest and to make themselves heard. In respect of funding and defunding, just to briefly mention this, I don't think we're going to see a defunding of the police in the way that perhaps Black Lives Matter would have expected or anticipated in the States. We've seen a number of issues emerge in Chicago, and Chicago was held up as one of the cities of prime police reform in 2018 onwards. And it hasn't worked out in this way that they thought, either in terms of the police oversight body, in terms of the mayor's actions, or in terms of long-term reform. They haven't precipitated or crystallized as we probably would have wanted, would have hoped, and so on. So in that end, whatever happens within the social movement itself, and I know that's something that Zilka talked about as a possible third question for today, collaborations around social movements and that kind of thing. Very briefly, I would say that wherever they go, the police position is not going to change that much. It's probably going to become more entrenched. And going back to the English and Welsh case, I think it's going to become more entrenched. Which leads me to some of the points that I had set out today in terms of what do I see. I'm very much taking Graeme's lead in doing some stuff recently with students on the Supreme Court in England and Wales. One of the then Chief Justices said, I'm loath to predict because it makes a fool of anyone who tries to do it. But anyway, I'll try and give you my tuppence worth. Police are not going to change how they view their discretion. And I think because of that, that's going to have a knock-on effect in terms of legitimacy and accountability, and also in terms of consent of public. That dynamic is not going to change. So what police do in the street is going to have a knock-on effect to everything else. We have, though, seen, particularly in England and Wales, more so in the UK, that focus on engagement, explanation, encouragement, and enforcement. We've seen that come out in discourse in Scotland. We've seen it come out in terms of England and Wales, in terms of regulations. I think that's going to be an increasingly approach by the police in terms of the rhetoric they're going to use. I've done X, I'm moving to Y, now I'm moving to C, and then I'm moving to D. And if you don't move on, then well, I'm going to enforce what I need to do. One of the main problems I see across Northern Ireland, less so in Scotland, but also in England and Wales, is time and again inspectorates and others have come out and said, well, what police are failing to do is risk assess in terms of at protest or what they need to do or how they scale up for it. but also in terms of the use of force. And time and again, use of force is the headline issue. And it's become, I think, one of the mainstay issues that doesn't disappear in terms of protests. That is going to be a concern looking down the line. In terms of the people who oversee police and what they do, I think we're going to see it. We have seen a number of problems there, and we're going to continue to see them. Some of the problems I'm talking about, what I've called for today is called funny speak. So, for example, there's a phrase that comes out from the IOPC in 2018 in relation to a protest incident, and it was called distraction dysfunction strikes. A police officer was found not guilty on the basis of him using distraction dysfunction strikes. There is no basis or nowhere else that I can find a reference to this, whether it's the College of Policing or other police force regulations or policies that have been released to the public. But yet the IOPC has gone with it. And more recently in Northern Ireland, the police ombudsman there found that a Black Lives Matter protest during COVID-19, the police handling of it was discrimination, but it wasn't racial. It was damaging, but they didn't consider human rights. So what is it the police did or didn't do? And the report, I don't think, really makes clear over, I think it's 89 pages, what exactly happened, what was going on. I think we're going to see a lot more distraction. If you take Scotland, for example, the two inspectorates there did a recent examination. And what did they do? They looked at the IT technology rather than what's happening on the streets in terms of policing them during COVID, which I think was completely the wrong direction. In terms of shadow dealings, we had in Northern Ireland that we found out after the math that the Public Prosecution Service told us that the Police Service Northern Ireland had been dealing with the nationalist community kind of on the QT, but not known to the loyalist community. And that generated some frustrations there. In terms of outcomes, what actually happens when a protest or police are found to be in fault or in breach of certain things, what emerges? And in the Irish case, there's been numerous reports from the Garda Ombudsman body, and every time you're left wondering, what was the outcome here? What has happened? And I think that's going to continue in all police services across the jurisdictions. And then finally, in terms of penalty notices, in the most recent report on protests, the Inspector in England and Wales has proposed imposition of penalty notices for people found in breach of certain things, those bodies out of place, as Graeme would put it. If that idea goes ahead, it arguably net widens yet again in terms of those accessing or entering into the criminal justice system, much like Finn's own experience in the past. And this is arguably detrimental to the overall idea of justice. Very briefly, in terms of others, I don't think our reliance on the European Convention of Human Rights, the European Court of Human Rights, is necessarily going to be a positive outcome or a place to kind of begin to look. From 1959 to 2020, there were, in the number of judgments in terms of a right to assembly or freedom of expression, there were only 4 against the UK. So England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland, none against Ireland. And in terms of freedom of expression, there were 12 judgments against the UK and 2 against Ireland. Low numbers, and I don't think it's going to necessarily represent the kind of the place to find an optimistic outcome in the future. And finally, in terms of the UK Parliament, it has more or less dismissed that any major human rights breaches, whether it was 2004, 2011, and again recently in terms of large-scale protests, the G20 protests and so on. It also viewed the G20 protests particularly as being a remarkably successful police operation. I don't think the death of Ian Tomlinson could be considered a successful operation in any sense of the term. So what I would say is, looking down the line in terms of legislative amendments, in terms of where the inspectorates have gone, in terms of police discourse, we're not going to see too much change. I think the change is going to have to come, if it does come, in terms of how people organise and make themselves visible on the street, as Finn and Graeme would put it.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so we have heard a lot about continuities, change and the future. And we have now about half an hour in which the speakers could again respond to one another if they want to. But we also open it up to the audience, and we have already one comment